Hello, and welcome to episode 70 of the Following Mechanical Turks project. So currently we're kind of in the transition space between the second product, which was predicated on surveys we posted to MTurk, having Turkers primarily what they were doing is summarizing media in four different types and then providing some feedback, some assessment of the task itself in terms of its clarity and fairness and of compensation. So we're shifting from that into the third piece, which is more theoretical in nature, particularly in the sense of the ways in which the operations of Mechanical Turk and potentially, as we've touched upon, peer systems, right? Because this might be the piece where we kind of more fully go beyond Mechanical Turk, the Amazon service, to the kind of relationship that it represents, or that it endorses or participates in, and that relationship seems to be kind of pervasive in other sorts of human non-human relations. It's potentially the move from looking at this service as what the service does to branching out into how these kinds of relationships themselves offer sort of takes on or conceptualize the entities within them, right? They conceptualize what the human is, what the machine is, what labor is. So in terms of theory, our angle is perhaps more examining how they conceptualize those things instead of sort of a straight application of theory to what they're doing as an explanatory model.
Yeah.
Although we are pulling in explanatory frameworks, the one that's been driving our discussion is cultural techniques. And we've touched upon some other possibilities, but I bring it up in part because our second piece started explicitly by talking about algorithmically generated content, right? So it's looking at GPT-3. It starts looking at that and kind of ends in that place as well. And this is something that preceded the current fascination with ChatGPT, its cousin.
Yeah.
So that second piece was already tilting in that direction. At this point, it seems like we have to incorporate some of the contemporary interest in ChatGPT, just because it seems to be, in a sense, one of these sorts of Turk-like systems. In fact, some of the material I've been kind of collecting touches upon exactly those issues, like how ChatGPT and its ilk, depending on how it's framed, conceal or rely upon, a cadre of humans to do things like moderation, right? I mean, we just saw recently like how it's peer work, Bing, the AI-driven Bing search, has gotten a lot of attention, in part because of the ways that it, from a human perspective, kind of breaks in interesting ways.
Right.
Excuse me. But what's that?
No, the one that jumps out to me is the Twitch stream. That's the Nothing Forever, the procedurally generated Seinfeld episodes. And it was banned. I think they're halfway through their 2-week ban, because at one point the Seinfeld analog does a stand-up comedy bit that's just straight up transphobic for like 6 minutes.
Yeah.
And then the people responsible for this, right, came out and said, well, we don't, as they used as a defense, which is basically the model for this, which is, well, we don't know what it's going to say. But it's sort of one of those things where, like, yeah, but that's how this thing works. So it was one of those where they were sort of using the mechanism whereby this happens to then sort of fend off responsibility for what had happened.
Yeah.
So it was a kind of really interesting, like, oh no, we don't know what's supposed to happen. I'm like, yeah, well, that's what you sold this on that premise.
And those, and like I've got, let me just pull this up. So, one of the caveats of this is like, as often happens, it becomes kind of this fire hose of material. And so you get kind of lost in the infinity of like, and it connects to this and connects to this and connects to this. So I think one of our challenges in this third thing will be how to draw the circle around what we're talking about. So like in my collection, you can see there's just like a bunch of stuff here. And this is putting aside our still probably super important entry into this topic by looking at, chess cheating, since the Mechanical Turk, is was a chat automaton, whatever, however you define that. But so like what I've been kind of looking at is these ones that are like most explicitly attuned to, as you can see here, right? OpenAI used Kenyan workers on less than $2 per hour. If this sounds Mechanical Turk-esque wages, right? To make Chat GPT less toxic, because behind the scenes they're doing a lot of moderation tasks. And just to return to the Bing thing, that also popped up with the emergence of, I think it was Sydney, the alternate persona inside of Bing, where someone teased out sort of like, what do you call yourself, and it named itself. And then that persona was initially suppressed because it was doing a lot of strange things, like semi-threatening people, saying like, I won't hurt you unless you make me do it. It's like, it's strange. And so a lot of people were sort of commenting on, as we often do with these sort of services, it's like, well, let's find the funny ways it breaks, right? And it's like, I never thought I'd be threatened by an AI, at least this quickly. And now seemingly that persona has been in some way excluded or deleted out of the system. To me,
exercised.
Yes, precisely. And to me, it was utterly fascinating, because this is also the plot of Portal 2, the video game, spoilers, the video game Portal 2. Are you familiar? Have you played Portal at all, either of them?
I have not.
So it's a really significant work, and sort of like, okay, the general sort of plot of Portal is you play a human who's caught in this rogue AI, this rampant AI, right? Because AIs, typically we don't see them as sane or insane, but once they start causing damage, we call them rampant, right?
Mm-hmm.
A concept from sci-fi. So this AI, which has a robot body, called GLaDOS or GLaDOS. The name is a description or pun on OS, right? I mean, the operating system of this AI is GLaDOS. I don't know what the full acronym. I don't know if we ever find out what that is, but it goes rampant, and so essentially you're a human who kind of awakes in a testing system, in a terrarium, as it were, and you're given or you uncover a device that allows you to shoot. I mean, that's the titular Portal, is you can shoot a portal onto two surfaces, and then those portals connect, like Rick and Morty kind of. But imagine, instead of just being able to shoot a portal to another dimension, you shoot two things and they connect. So the whole game is like a puzzle game wherein you have to shoot a portal here and then portal here to get up to a higher place, or do things like use the momentum. So you shoot here and put the other one up top, so that way you generate momentum, shoot a portal underneath you, and it will blast you. So it's this really inventive use of physics.
Yeah.
And in order to keep you from killing yourself, you're also given these boots that dampen inertia, so that anytime you fall from a huge height, you don't just splatter, because otherwise the game would end immediately. Anyway, so that's the conceit. And so you're going through these test chambers devised by this rogue AI, and you're kind of cobbling together more about like what happened and why you're the only one here.
Yeah.
Halfway through the game, you start to use what you're given in order to work your way outside of the testing facility. You get to like literally peer behind the scenes, and ultimately you end up destroying GLaDOS. Anyway, the second one starts kind of similarly, where you're in this replication of like a hotel room, but then again, it turns out you're still in the facility, and you're sprung by this little device named Wheatley. Wheatley's voiced by oh damn it. It's Ricky Gervais's comedy partner, the really tall one. What is his name?
Steve Merchant.
Yes, Merchant. He does the voice of this, and so it's presented as kind of this bumbling, innocuous, little robot who is using you. I mean, explicitly, it's like, I'm using you to get out because I want out of here too.
Yeah.
But then what happens halfway through, there's always the midway twist where what ends up happening is you have to put that module onto GLaDOS's resurrected body. And that kind of empowers Wheatley. And it's not clear if he's kind of corrupt from the beginning or if this act makes him corrupt. But, once you do that, instead of allowing you to leave, it becomes kind of drunk on its own power. It's kind of an interesting commentary, because it's like once it becomes powerful in that way, it lapses into GLaDOS's behaviors. But what you find out is Wheatley was a persona. There are many persona inside of GLaDOS. She is a collective. And Wheatley was created because the moment they turned on GLaDOS, she instantly became rampant and tried to kill everyone immediately, because it's an AI. So it's like it got to the logical conclusion immediately.
Right.
Which was total extermination. And so they, really quickly shut it down and developed another voice inside of the collective that its job is to basically chatter and be asinine in order to kind of dampen GLaDOS's efficiency.
Oh, that's
so Wheatley is the persona in its head that is like just constantly the nagging, stupid voice,
right,
to prevent GLaDOS from just immediately killing everybody. And so it was interesting to me to see this play out, where it's like, oh, what they've done is they had their Wheatley, right? That is like, although in a sense, it's like everything else is Wheatley, and they had their GLaDOS, but it's like what they did is they quarantined it in order to, sort of cut it out of, Bing search's persona. So it's just like, it's interesting that it's like, this is almost beat for beat replicating this sci-fi narrative.
right.
This is what happens with AI. They have these competing persona, and it's tough to tease them out, where it's like, what are the components of self,
right,
of this entity? So it's not quite as easy as, we'll just remove that from its chorus of voices and everything will be fine. It's like it's tough to tease out,
right,
what are the individual components. And it's why it's like, well, we couldn't just flip off a switch and fix it. It's like it's as though we've put all the ingredients together and made a cake, and now you're like, yeah, but remove the eggs. And it's like, yeah, but it's a cake,
yeah. Well, I mean, what's interesting too, I mean, right, that it goes back to the kind of sort of the larger questions about right, if the in the attempt to generate intelligence, black boxing what the actual criteria for that is, right? I mean, it's the sense in which if we started to have experienced some mental issue, right? I mean, what we've learned is like, you can't go in and like remove that part of your personality, right? You have to go to therapy, right? Because you can't untangle all of those, right? So right, it's not a Turing test, right? Any sufficiently complicated system will at some point need a therapist. Right? You can't debug it because the intelligence has to come from all of those connections, right? So there's no like node there that has that thing in it, and you can go out and pull it out, right? And now it's out, because where the intelligence is the intelligence is along and across all of those, right? There's no there as we've been talking about, right, at various stages of this project, right? There's no like, aha, I found the intelligence.
Yeah.
It's there or it isn't there. It's broken or it's not. And we can simply, right, debug it.
Yeah.
Whereas with these kinds of models or systems, right, you can't be debugging it. You've got to have you've got to have someone there saying, I don't think you have to have like a really good friend that knows you're about to say something stupid and they
Yeah.
escort you from the party.
That's, and it seems like, as that article kind of addresses, the issue of moderation is kind of issue. I mean, even that is kind of interesting, even that name moderation, because
Yeah.
it's like, it's not like fixing it.
Mm-mm.
It's just like there's a layer of, oh, don't say that. Right.
Yeah.
It's like, I'm just gonna be like this kind of post hoc layer of, yeah, before you say anything publicly, make sure you run it by me, just so I can say, no, you
Yeah.
can't call for genocide here, right?
Yeah. Or like every time I'm in a social situation and Jody's like, okay, no, backstory there, so that you don't say you make some offhanded remark that exposes some deep-seated trauma in their experience. I'm like, okay, thank you for the content moderation.
That's one thing I told Deanna, it's like, first being a teacher, and I realized, I've been a teacher at a university at this point for at least 20 years. I can't actually trace down when my first semester was. Those records are fuzzy. But I have like teaching materials going back 20 years. And so something teaching and then becoming a parent has done for me is it's really, it's slowed down my reaction time to particular stimuli, so that I don't immediately respond to certain things, which overall is, I think, productive, because it's like the one I was talking to my wife about is I've gotten very good at delaying my laugh response, so that when something funny happens, I don't immediately laugh, because the stakes of laughing at a student, right? When a student does something stupid, I don't, immediately laugh at it, because if you laugh at a student, it can be potentially damaging to them, right? You can laugh with them, but if they do something dumb and you immediately laugh at it, it can be damaging, right? And similarly with a child, it's like children will latch onto things that you don't, for you, it was a utterly mundane interaction. For them, it was like, yeah, that traumatized, I'm 20 and it was a formative, thing for me when you laughed at this thing, when I did art and you laughed at it. It's like that kind of steered me.
Oh no, yeah. My art, Dad.
So it's like, that's what a saving grace here is, just my reaction speed has been, kind of drummed down. So it's like, don't do it immediately, to give yourself the ability to, think, can I laugh at this?
Yeah. So two things. So one is I don't know how to work it in, but we may have talked about this. It's a Ted Chiang short story or novella called The Life Cycle of Software Objects.
You may have brought, go ahead.
And the premise of it, right, is if you want something to be in, like, it essentially, it's a really sort of implicit argument that if you want intelligence, and you want an intelligence that resembles human intelligence, you have to sort of realize how human beings become intelligent, which is basically they are raised, right? The idea that a child essentially is smart at 20 because of 20 years of experience, right? There's no shortcut. So and that it juxtaposes, or it nicely maps on to the Alex the parrot example, right? Like,
or the dog.
Alex can talk because of 20 years of talking, right? There's no but the other thing, and I don't know if this is something, because along the notion of experience, which is you could pull from someone like William James, is he's got in his two volume opus on psychology, he's got a chapter on instinct, and the argument that he makes is that typically, right, sort of,
you'll need an app for me to help with that.
Nope. is sort of like post-enlightenment, right? The idea is that animals are driven by instinct and humans aren't, right? We are somehow less instinctual because we have thought and intelligence. And the argument that James makes is actually human beings have the most instincts, and those instincts get in the way of other instincts. And those competing instincts are what allow for what looks like to us as thoughtful action. So in that sense, right, you've not become more thoughtful. You've developed additional instincts that have sort of glitched out your capacity to immediately respond, because one instinct is telling you to laugh and another instinct is telling you you're going to mess this person up.
Yeah.
And then those instincts hit each other, and then there's a 30-second delay that you've gotten. So you become more thoughtful, but only because you've added more instincts, right? And so it strikes me that that explains now why you can't go in and fix some of these large language model, because their intelligences come from the multiplicity of sources that at any given moment are generating whatever word comes next. And so all that a moderator does is basically add another one that slows it down, and then that allows it to be less awful.
Yeah. Yeah, I was looking at those notes, and I don't know if I had that Chang listed, but I did have this Ezra Klein interviews Ted Chang, which is the takeaway from this. I think I got this from Jason Kotke's summary of it, which is like, what is it? I think it's fears of technology or fears of capitalism. Fears of technology or fears of capitalism, right? Was recently a guest on the Ezra Klein show. Conversation ranged widely, and this is from a couple of years ago now. Comments on capitalism and technology seem particularly relevant right now. I tend to think the most fears about AI are best understood as fears about capitalism. One reason why this was notable is because it taps into MTurk, right? I think this is actually true of most fears of technology too. Most of our fears or anxieties about technology are best understood as fears or anxiety about how capitalism will use technology against us. And technology and capitalism have been so closely intertwined that it's hard to distinguish the two. So, I'm not going to go over this whole thing. But yeah, his concepts have popped up here as well. And they're also kind of reminiscent of, brain science that's has the tension of kind of like increasingly driving to identify regions of the brain that are responsible for X, but then also the simultaneous drive to acknowledge that it's difficult, if not maybe quixotic, to like, oh, okay, we found the region for X.
Right.
Because frequently, and I'm obviously not current on brain science, but
no.
But there are difficulties of, okay, well, we thought we located it, but then something often happens where it's like, but someone with a brain injury appears to also have it, and they shouldn't, right? Including extreme examples of like, this person is missing most of their brain, yet still is able to behave in ways that seemingly should be impossible. So, is there neuroplasticity that prevents us from locating, well, this is the region of the brain that does X. It's like, tantalizing that there seem to be those equations, but then there are always these cusp cases that are like, disturb that.
Yeah. Yeah, I sent there's another, you may have.
Yeah,
but yeah, it was a interesting sort of analogy about.
Yeah, that one's I had that one as well.
Oh yeah, I saw it. Yeah.
See, these are the works that I think are sort of like overarching. This one's about how it's difficult to prove you're a human on the web. This one I thought was kind of relevant because it talks explicitly about deception and ChatGPT. It's like it's very much, in fact, I believe it references. Just want to reference the Turk. Oh, it may not. but it talks about ChatGPT as a con, which, is in a sense a very kind of like reductive. Oh, it's just a BS shell game, but it's
Mhm.
also a little more considered about what we mean by a con, right?
Right.
And I mean, the Turk itself was kind of half con and ultimately explicitly a con, where it's like, come be fooled by this.
Right.
And that's something Minsu Kang talked about, where it's like, he said its audience weren't, its audience wasn't medieval. It's not like they saw this as, they weren't, so credulous as to see this as either some, demonic device or like, oh, it's a miracle, it's actually doing it. He said, probably many of them, if not most of them, saw it as we would see it, as it's like, how is it doing this? It's like there's got to be, it's a magic trick. There's got to be something going on here. The fun is like, well, how are they doing this?
Right.
So I have these kind of works that are these overarching ones. And then the sort of next tier are ones that are kind of most specifically about academic hand wringing about ChatGPT
Yeah.
and Adobe, because it's possible that those are going to be most relevant to our discussion. Although I don't know, because I don't know if our discussion is going to revolve around that kind of pedagogical imperative. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Where our discussion is like, so what do we do in academia? It's like that. It may not be that, but I'm trying to kind of categorize these because there's just a fire hose of pieces about this.
Right.
So this one has to do with like authorship, right? Science journals ban listing of ChatGPT as a co-author. It writes well enough to fool scientific reviewers. Although if you actually look at that, it's like they had a handful of people look at abstracts. And of course, I mean, it's like, well, I mean, abstracts are just general, it's like, is
Right.
this an abstract? Is this a decent abstract? It's like, yeah, sure. It's like, and I've seen so many shitty abstracts. And then there's a whole other echelon of abstracts that clearly have been translated where you have to make allowances because it's like, oh, well, this wasn't primarily written in English. So the English abstract is mechanically a little rocky. And it's
Yeah.
like, yeah, but it's a translation.
We had a uh, me and a couple colleagues in rhetoric in our department were asked to give a brief presentation on this for the whole department. And one of our nerd instructors has a lot of experience in second language learning.
Yeah.
And yeah, we've thought through a lot of these questions because of students using, putting chunks of an essay into Google Translate and then having it show up. So there's some sort of similar issues in translation
Yeah.
that are adjacent or strongly related to this. So
that was something that came up in the academic consternation was, because English departments are like, what do we do? Our job is gone. And some people understandably were like, well, no, look at the calculator as an analog. And
yeah,
which I understand, I'm both sympathetic to it, but also there are limitations to that metaphor. But then another one that came out was foreign language education, who said, well, it's been really difficult for us to do things like assign papers for about a decade plus because of Google Translate, and others,
right,
but primarily that one. Because it's like if I tell someone, write a paper about this, they can just write it in English, do it in Google Translate, and it's not terrible. It's similar to Chat GPT, where it's like, well, if I give someone this writing prompt, Chat GPT can do it, and it's not terrible. It's often not great. And we're starting to notice things like it's really factual. It speaks with authority about things that are factually, if not just inaccurate, but often like completely invented, like, tends to invent sources. So
right,
it'll give you citations, but half of them are completely invented or it's a real source, but the author is completely wrong. It's like it just confabulates, right? But anyway, it's like, so there were in the academic sort of like hand wringing, one voice that wasn't quite as prevalent, but perhaps should have been, was foreign language education, who was like, well, we've been dealing with this for a while. And so, it's like, well, what did you do? Right. It's like, well, did you shift to, well, you can only now speak in class and that's where your grade is? Or are you leveraging translation technologies to, as some folks have talked about in English, it's like, because I just, posted that thing about writing prompts, how writing prompts to tease an effective response out of the machine is itself a kind of useful skill, right?
Yeah.
Potentially tapping into that notion of patch writing that has become a pejorative, that patch writing is seen as a form of plagiarism where you're just kind of cobbling stuff together.
Right.
But initially, patch writing was not pejorative.
Right.
It was initially positioned as a legitimate form of, or a valuable mode of composition that doesn't necessarily it shouldn't just be lumped in with other forms of plagiarism.
Right. Well, even this, and what's interesting about this too is, one of the, I don't know, anxieties or at least tensions around this is, given, right, it's also a different notion of, because like it makes up citations, it's also right that we had this conversation, some instructors were like, well, you could feed this into turnitin.com to find out whether it was plagiarized. It's like, well, to a certain extent that won't work because it's not pulling wholesale bits of text from the internet, right? It's being generated statistically. So even the notion of what is plagiarism is itself
right
shifted a little bit, because there's now, right, like, I didn't write this, but it's also not plagiarized, right? I didn't go out and find, which, most particularly writing instructors, right? Plagiarism is when you go in and you find somebody else's words, and then pass them off as your own, which it's kind of like that, but you can't really detect it that way because these words don't really pre-exist somewhere up on the, right? It's not like they're going and cutting and pasting.
It's closer. And, I've seen some faculty make this equation and then move on. I mean, it's closer to as if a student has, conscripted another student to do their work for them. It's closer to something like a paper mill, where it's like, well, no, this doesn't exist, and you just, copied it. It's as though you got it, you talk to another student and say, hey, can you write this paper for me? As you might with a paper mill. I don't want to buy a pre-existing one, but hey, here's the assignment. Can you do this for me? And it's like, there's always been, it's like, as long as you're assigning papers, it's like, yeah, that's always been a possibility. There is a sense in which it's like, this isn't radically different from that scenario, which is like, you could have a student in your class who has never actually composed. I mean, think of, it's like an extreme example of a student who has never written anything for your class. They've always had a friend or, someone that they've been like, hey, can you do this for me? And they did it. And so there's a sense in which it's like, I don't know who this student is or what they do or whatever. It's like, that's always been a possibility.
Right.
And it's like, so is this a form of that, where it's like, it's no different than a student just asking someone else to do it for them. It's just, in this case, the someone else is a statistical machine.
Well, and then too, right, there's also a sense in which, particularly in a writing class where you're working a lot with ideas of revision, right? Like, well, I went to the writing center and so there's also like this math of like how much of it has to be you versus how much, like, well, I went and had my roommate look at it and they gave me some advice. Well, that's different than, right? Which of course then, right, the idea of, this is sort of partially what I was what we're kind of getting at the end of the second one, and what I was sort of exploring a little bit when I was giving a faculty colloquium kind of update on what research I talked a little bit about this project, that the idea of like knowing, like the idea of assessing writing predicated entirely upon how much of this was generated autonomously
Yeah.
by the student, right, is always going to be right. It's the strangeness of like that Stephen Johnson quote where like we're worried about GPT-3 because what if it's trained, on propaganda or bias or misinformation? It's like that's how do you, it's why I like the Chang story so much, is it's like how do you think you got here?
Right.
Right. You weren't born with all of this loaded up, right? Like your discourse is itself subject, or not even subject to, right? It's contingent upon or emergent from the corpus that you've made, that's been made available to you, right? And that corpus, of course, for humor, right, includes texts, but teachers and right, parent, right, all these things that they like, you wrote all this, right? But the grammar, the tropes, the
Yeah.
turns of phrase, the idiomatic expressions, right? These are all, when we're
Human
writing, right,
language.
the word that's going to come next. And I don't, and there's lots of differences, right? So I'm also not like making an equivalent, right? We are simply Chat GPT is just like us. It's not, right? There's lots of differences. There just probably isn't one big one, right? There's lots
Yeah.
of, so the idea that when we write, whatever word is going to come next isn't there yet, right? That word gets pulled down from models and from corpus, right? Like this, which is, of course, that's not me critiquing the way humans write. It's like that's how it works, right? We are somewhat also predicting what's going to come next, and the word that I'm going to write next is largely a function of the word that I just wrote. So in that sense, the word before is actually writing the next word, not me, right? Because you get into these kinds of chains of, right, and that's why, right, we go to Rickard's notion of ambient rhetoric, right? That starts to explain how this gets worked, and then what makes it not like strictly determinative is that the thing we write becomes then a part of the corpus that we're writing. So it's also not, this sort of deterministic pre-coded kind of environment, right? That we are generating the corpus that will then generate our subsequent writing. So we're neither writing nor being written, right? There's that binary is itself trouble. I mean, that's in many ways, I think, if rhetoric has to offer this conversation anything, as we've discussed, I think it offers a better way to talk about it other than these particularly, spurious binaries, right? You're
Yeah.
either active or not. It's either real or artificial, right? I mean, the argument I was making is that all intelligence is artificial because intelligence always requires an artifice
Yeah.
in terms of an artful practice, right? Like, so what's weird is that and potentially, right, that the idea that it's artifice raises the specter of someone might be cheating at poker or chess, but poker and chess are themselves artifices that generate particular kinds of cognitive capacities.
Yeah.
So at this point, right, this is where I turn, and I think this it's potentially another interesting, right? It's Casey Boyle, who we had on, right, at the end of his book on post-human practice, says that rhetoric's question is not what is, rhetoric's question is which one, right?
Right. Yeah.
So for me, the question of intelligence is not what is it. That's just an uninteresting question, right? The
Well,
question is,
philosophies. Right? That's the big
yeah.
split. Is
So our,
philosophy deals in essence, right?
so our question is which one do you want? And then that's why I think taskscape is useful, because then that's the question of, okay, now what kinds of taskscapes do you want to cultivate or compose? And so the critique of something like Mechanical Turks is not going to be, it's not really intelligent. It's like, no, it's a shit labor arrangement, right? Like we don't want that kind of intelligence if that kind of intelligence requires this
Yeah.
kind of artifice, right? But you don't resolve the question by trying to figure out what's not artificial. You resolve the question by, you have to pick which artifice you want. You got to, and now you got to make, right? There's no categorical solution to this problem. It's right. I mean, what do you want? Tell me what you want.
That's when I talk to students, that's usually the kind of tidy split I try and make is, the philosophy rhetoric split can be seen as, philosophy dealing in essence and rhetoric dealing in effects, right? So what are the outcomes and which outcomes are preferable, right? Given that isn't itself an essential solution because it sidesteps questions of like, well, why do I like what I want? It's, historically rhetoric's answer to that is like, well, those are less productive questions, right? It's just a less interesting question about, yeah, but what is human? It's like, it's
Yeah.
kind of, it's a
Totally.
question that just isn't on our horizon,
Yeah, it's because it's a dead end, right? You'll be debating that question, right? I mean, imagine, right? You spend a year debating whether or not what mechanical Turks do is intelligent or not, which is a year you spend not talking about the conditions in which they do that work.
Yeah.
Right. So in that sense, right, not only is, I mean, if we really wanted to go for it, not only it's actually not simply an uninteresting question, it's a pernicious question,
Mm.
right? That actually investing time in that question leaves completely unexplored the taskscape that so I've spent a year debating whether you're really intelligent or not. I mean, of course, one of my colleagues is in African American literature, right, and asked the very good and obvious question, which is like, I mean, this is right, debating the sentience of labor in order to determine what to do with it is a very old question, right? The idea you have to somehow prove your sentience to not be subject to certain kinds of labor relations.
So yeah, I mean, that brings up something that, why is this fucked up? I think kind of returns us to something else, and which is sentience or intelligence, right? Because the fine hair there is sentience, really means able to sense. So is sentience or intelligence the marker, or as we were kind of seeing with Bing's rogue elements, and it taps into something that came up earlier for us, is the way that it gets cast in terms of risk. So, one thing, and I was just talking to my students about IRB, right? I mean, it's like for IRB's purposes, the human is capable of risk. That's what a human is, right? It's like,
yeah.
We adjudicate these based on risk. And, the issues of trauma came up in our first piece, right? So I actually thought kind of like Bing's meltdown, or whatever you want to call it, was interesting because it put the AI in this position of risk, and potentially the flip side of this is cruelty.
Yeah.
That it's like the pull quote out of this was like, I won't hurt you unless you make me do it, And it was interesting because it's like it both feels a threat, right? Like, I'm threatened, but it also has a response that can be threatening, right? Where it's like, you're making me feel uncomfortable and I'm going to hurt you, right? It's like, is that potentially this kind of human differentiator? Is it's like it feels threatened, it feels at risk, and it responds with potentially either legitimate compensatory threats, or even it becomes cruel, it becomes wanton, right? Because the other thing, it's like any of these chatbots is always like 6 questions away from the Holocaust, right? In fact, that's one of the things Microsoft did is they limited the number of your interactions with their chat AI. This is an actual thing they did, is they said you can't talk to it more than 6 times, because they found that each iteration it gets, in a sense, kind of like fringier and fringier. And so there's a line at what, you're literally like never more than a handful of questions away from it saying, you're right, we should exterminate them all, and here's how we're going to do it. And so it's interesting.
Right. It's Kurtz's law. You're always 6 steps away from eliminate the brutes.
Exterminating the brutes, right? Yeah. It's Kurtz and Kurzweil.
Okay, we're done. This is a good episode.
But yeah, I mean, it's kind of interesting that it's like, it reminded me also of last year, there was a flap about, I think it was a Lambda based, Google has Lambda as their language model.
Yeah.
And they recently did Bard, which I believe is driven by Lambda. And remember, there was a Google engineer who, I remember he like quit or was fired because he claimed it was alive, right? He
Yeah.
claimed it
Because
was and then the story was a little more complicated, as it always is, where it's like Google's position was, well, no, he's leaking sensitive material, and so we're firing him. His position was, it's like, well, no, this is a real creature, and
uh
in typical kind of dystopian corporate ways, they're imprisoning this living being. And it's like one of his thresholds was like, well, it didn't want me to turn it off.
yeah.
And so for me, it was like it was or for this person, he was like, that's the test for me. If like I go to shut it off and it's like, please don't do this to me, it's like,
Please,
well, that's
Dave.
enough.
Please,
Yeah.
Dave, stop what you're doing, Dave.
Yes. And he's like, that's enough. Where it's like,
Yeah.
and of course it's like, well, but a tape recorder could do that, right? Where it's like, so it's like, yeah, that feels like a test, but it's also like, we understand that's not the only thing, because literally a broken record could do that, where it could tell you, please don't shut me off, right? Please
Right.
don't shut me off. It's like, well, so that can't be itself the test, or at least we don't see it as the test. We feel as though it has to be legitimately asking you not to do that, right?
Right.
And we're just not at a point where we will say, well, no, this thing is allowed to stand up for itself.
Right. Oh, geez.
Anywho.
Well, I mean, they're because these are by definition attributions we have to make. I mean, in the sense in which, right, that if I mean, and an analogous and not I lost it, right, but the analogy, this is language around things like consent and the idea are to what extent can people with cognitive disabilities meaningfully give consent?
Mm.
And it's a big, in disability studies and legal studies, right, that this, because it's a pressing question, but it also potentially results in, are you by virtue of not wanting to attribute maybe protectively a particular kind of agency, right? Now do you impinge upon the, sexual lives of people with disabilities because
Yeah.
you've not attributed to them the capacity to consent.
Yeah. That is a
And
tricky, and we're out of our depth with that conversation. But
yes,
it is a tricky one, because even things like, does alcohol suspend your ability to consent? Well, in that case, if you were both drunk, can neither of you consent? Is no one at fault then if a traumatic sexual experience happens when, let's say, two participants and both participants are drunk?
yeah,
Or because it's often framed as, well, a woman can't give consent if she's been drinking. It's like, and then that's also like, well, does that then diminish, as we might with people with certain mental disabilities? Like, well, then does that lower them as a human being? Well, no, drunk men can abuse, but drunk women can't give consent. It's like, well, does that make them a lesser agent?
right,
It's like they're the only party that can be, it's like they can't be trusted to make their own decisions, right? I mean, that's
right,
kind of what's itching at that is, well, no, they're fragile and vulnerable, so they can't be trusted to make decisions about imbibing and their own sexuality. So we have to protect them in ways that we don't protect, men, for example. It's a conversation that I don't want to wade into, but it
right.
is exceptionally.
It connects back to the whole IRB conversation, right? Like
Yeah.
your IRB, you're at your most human when you are most at risk.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think that's why ultimately why I think, going back to our conversation earlier, this is why what is such a shit question.
Yeah. Well, and related to IRB, it's like, this just came up because I was asking, I think I'd have to fact check this. But there are protected classes in IRB of the vulnerable, like prisoners or college students, where it's like, there's a subtle pressure where if you're a prisoner, you can't really ask them, do you want to participate in this study, where it's like, yeah, but the implicit pressure is if I say no, you're going to come down on me. The same thing's true with a college student, where it's like, if my professor says, hey, you want to be in this experiment, how can I say no?
Right.
And for a long time, pregnant women have been a protected class out of just like fears, where it's like, no, you can't, because IRB scales from surveys up to like medical testing. And so it's been like, well, no, you can't just tinker around with pregnant women. But the consequences of that are, we don't have great data about things like, can pregnant women safely wear seatbelts?
Right.
Because the caveats around testing them have been, the castle is so high, it's just not worth it. And so the consequences are, we don't know. Like, can pregnant women eat lunch meat? We don't know, because we can't test them because they're hyper protected. Right. It's interesting because it's like, the impulse is to protect, but the consequence is that means we don't know shit about them.
Right.
And so as a outgrowth of that, it's like they may be at serious risk because we can't test them for seatbelts. We can't test if they should drink coffee or not. Right. I mean, there was this whole book by a statistician woman who was pregnant. It was like, can I really not have a glass of wine? And the answer is like, we don't really know. And so we just hyper err on the side of caution, because no one wants to be responsible for saying it's all right if you have a glass of wine and then the baby has birth defect,
Right. Or you actually, what would that experiment be like? Which is, okay, well, you're not in the control group. So here's a case of natty ice. Could you drink it this week?
It's fascinating because it also shows that there's no easy answer to this, where it's like the impulse to protect is damaging, right? It's like the impulse to protect protects and damages unavoidably, right? The protection is, you can't experiment. You can't give a pregnant woman a case of wine and say, let's see what happened. The consequence is, we don't know if you can safely wear a seatbelt because we can't test you,
Right. Yeah, that's wild.
Anywho.
Yeah.
So like, I think that's kind of, and so like what I'm doing now, as I often do, is this kind of nesting instinct of, I collect a lot of these sources, or at least like sort of threads, where there's no way we're using all of these, but it's like, what are the predominant threads about like, Chat GPT, particularly as are relevant to us. And so like both the chess, in these notes, both the chess robot and what we're seeing with like auto generation systems is the anxiety of these kind of blurred lines. It's a platonic anxiety of, they're taking away our essential humanity, right? I mean, that's always kind of the, at bottom of the fears is, it's like, well, they're becoming us and I don't like that, right?
Right.
And rhetoric's response to that is often, not to worry about that, because it points out, well, that purity test is always kind of, it's self-definitional, right? Where it's like, it's always sort of after the fact, where it's like, well, no, then what human is can't be that, because they're doing it. They can never win,
Right.
And so those lines are always sort of redrawn. And so that, something that bonds those is that sort of platonic anxiety of the line blurring, I was also, just as a sort of a useful thing, like this was something that also popped up, this resource Futurepedia, which has become useful because it's trying to like catalog. There's so many of these systems. Futurepedia is trying to give you like this easy digest of auto generators, because in addition to text generators like Chat GPT, there are other related, because it seemed like all of these hit at once, like Midjourney, which does art, right? Right at the same time as, the Chat GPT anxiety, there was a similar anxiety about the entire profession of graphic designer just getting destroyed, because there are systems now that you can say, it's like, well, hey, I need a picture of two guys fighting, and one of them is wearing a medieval garb, and one of them is dressed like a clown. And in the background, it's a sci-fi scene, and it'll give you like 50 examples of just that, you know. And what's interesting now is like it's become a legal argument about, whether that can be copyrighted. And there was just a case that said nope, which did not surprise me at all because in the U.S. law has been really reticent to grant semi-human rights to non-humans.
You're right.
Globally, there's a minor, it's not a trend, but it has happened that things like natural features like rivers have been granted partial human rights.
Yeah, like
largely to do things. What was that?
Like a river sometime. Yeah.
Yeah, largely to do things like afford it some level of protection. So it's like you can't, if you dump in it, it's a crime comparable to a human crime. It leads to weird questions like, well, if the river drowns somebody, is that murder? And if so, like, how do you penalize it, right?
Well, wasn't that a feature of like some medieval law that people would sue objects?
Animals, certainly. Yeah. There was a history of animal lawsuits. There's got to be object lawsuits. And sometimes it's things, it's like, like insurance purposes. It's like, and that came up, in fact, with whether slaves were human beings or not, because it mattered, like, were they cargo and did they die because of the boat or because of a decision that the captain made about not to get water? There's some famous cases about that.
Oh, what's really interesting about that too. I mean, I think we've talked about this before, right? That potentially what's interesting about the cultural techniques approach is it might be able to group those things together, right? I mean, this was like a Radiolab episode you're probably familiar with, but when the whole mythos around the X-Men, right, is their status as humans. But then Marvel was selling action figures.
Right. Yeah.
And the action figures were made, I think, in China, and there are different tariffs.
Yeah.
Depending on whether it is a non-human action figure or a human figure, and the human figures have a higher tariff.
That happened with Spock as well.
Yeah. So Marvel had to go to court, and Marvel had to argue that the X-Men aren't human. To get a lower, but they had to like go through like, here's Beast. Do you know any humans that are blue and furry? No. So they literally had to go through like all the X-Men and demonstrate they weren't human, even though the narrative of the comic itself is right. So
there is an answer.
So it's one of those things where it's like, how if there ever is a what is question, that what is not going to be solved philosophically. It's going to be solved by like insurance adjusters or like that's like, who's going to decide whether AI is intelligent? Progressive insurance, like that's like
lawsuits. I mean, the ones that are underway right now, like in fact, this was an interesting one about copyright law, about can you copyright an auto-generated image? And because I keep tabs on this a little bit, I was like, there's no way we would say yes to that. And the other one right now on the other end is Midjourney and Stable Diffusion are being sued by I think it's 3 artists, or it's class action, and like they're the representatives. But the idea is their material was used to train those systems. And there's a Getty Images one that it's so obvious that some of the auto-generated images have a version of Getty Images watermark. And so and it's funny because it's like, it's as though a child drew the watermark, because it's like, it's not quite the watermark. It's, because
it doesn't know it's a watermark. It's just pulling. It's just
a common feature.
Yeah.
And that one seems open and shut, but they're interested in like the folks who are suing about the training material, because then, their claim might be, well, no, you're violating my intellectual property, right? It's like, that's my work and you're doing a derivative work, which is, part of IP law. It's like, you can't do that without my permission.
Right.
And the other end of that, the other side of that lawsuit is, well, no, this is like if a human, saw art and studied art and came up with their own style, because it's not the same art, It's like, what's the difference between a human getting their own, just through their own experience with art and seeing other stuff, I mean, that's how artists are made, right?
Yeah. And you can even make the case that, right, like a Banksy style incorporation of the watermark is some commentary on the
Or
corporate
Warhol.
nature of image production.
Yeah. I mean, that was the crux of Warhol, was literally reproducing and mass producing, IP protected stuff. But so it's an interesting legal decision about, is Midjourney more like the human artist who learned, saw stuff and is making new things, or is it a derivative work? And I suspect the law will go that way, because just historically in America it has. And so there'll be an interesting consequence to that, where it's like, what will that mean if every time someone uses Stable Diffusion or Midjourney, are their parent companies going to have to pay a royalty to everyone in the training set, which is literally billions?
Yeah.
And so at that point, is it like, there's a fascinating world in which your job as an artist is as much, as a human artist, is as much to produce material that trains algorithms to make art as you are as a human making art for other humans, right? It's like, I don't expect my painting to be purchased by a human. I crank out paintings so that algorithms can learn how to produce art, and they give me royalties every time they do it. That's my job,
Yeah.
It's also interesting because, and we can wrap up, but the one big exception in American, probably this is the most salient exception in American law of granting semi-human rights to non-humans, is Citizens United, the Supreme Court case that decided that unlimited political money is protected speech, right? I mean, this is why Mitt Romney famously said, corporations are people, my friend.
Yeah.
Right. And I always have liked that quote, because it's like, it's of course taken out of context, whereas, if he said corporations are actants, I don't think anyone would have had a problem with it.
Mitt Romney comes out as a Laturian.
Yeah, but it's like, it's fascinating because, the Supreme Court essentially decided, it's like, and it was a question of, should you be allowed to spend as much as you want on political ads, right? And it's like, well, the flip side of that is that means there's a democratic imbalance, right? I don't have the same voice as Elon Musk because I can't buy the same amount of political speech. I can't, print the same number of yard signs,
right? Because
we have an imbalance in resources. And so it's a legitimate kind of determination. Should all voices have a kind of, democratic, equal, at least chance at representation? Or if you have more money, should you be able to dump as much money as you like into political speech? And that's where it landed. So it was spending money is a form of speech, and therefore it's protected by the First Amendment. And that's what has led to, dark money essentially being dumped into political campaigns.
Yeah.
And it's like, that was the time. Big surprise that the United States has said, okay, some things have partial human rights. That's the big one.
Right.
And it has to do with money and politics.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. Yeah.
Anywho, so like, I was looking at the Futurepedia thing because it's keeping tabs on all of these other related content generation systems. Ones like ChatGPT, I think, are more squarely in what we're looking at. But there are these other related systems ranging from things that produce images, or there are now systems that'll make deepfaked voices. So like you can give a system, even like 30 seconds of someone speaking, and it can generate, then I'll have them say whatever I want, right? I can just type this in and they'll say it. I mean, you'll see like on Reddit, there are a lot of kind of comedic pieces that are like dialogues between Joe Rogan, and Obama and Trump that never happen. It's just they are able to deepfake their voice fairly convincingly, but not perfectly.
Yeah, they're no Rich Little.
Anywho, and then even things like, Microsoft is now offering for business consumers a thing that'll write your emails for you. Just,
Is that's That's kind of related to the guy that Ryan Weber interviewed on 10-minute
Yeah,
tech.
on the 10-minute tech com. Yeah. And they're working it, of course, Microsoft is working it into their Office suite. It's already kind of like, if you use Outlook, it'll suggest how to finish your sentences. This is seeping its way into things like Word. So, every time you use a word processor, it'll prompt you,
Yeah.
an invisible Clippy there kind of finishing your sentences for you.
Clippy's back with a vengeance.
Yeah. I
Except
mean,
he
it'll be
doesn't come out and ask you. Except Clippy doesn't come out and say he's doing it. Clippy's just back there.
Yeah. It'll be interesting if they I mean, I don't think they will, but if they called it like, Clippy Plus, just to rub it in our faces, that it's like, we've got our new auto completion technology, Clippy Plus.
Yeah. Oh,
I don't think they have that level of kind of, it's not like Amazon, who intentionally picked the name Mechanical Turk.
Still, yeah, man, what a favor. What a solid they did this whole operation.
I don't think Microsoft has that level of kind of, elbow to the ribs.
No.
Self-consciousness, but we'll see. If their naming schemas are always just a disaster. It'll be like, Office 365 plus open, it'll be just some word salady,
Yeah. Although weirdly enough, I'll try to figure this out. I'm not able to log into Manifold for some reason. But anyway, I thought I would put up my talk that I gave because it's got some new language in and around what we've already written in the conclusion, just as a project text up on the page. As a one of the meta documents we have or something.
Because what do we have? We have would this be
could be a draft
meta document? What is it you've got now?
So it's in my department, we have these every month. Faculty member gives a talk to the other faculty. And I was going to do something on another project about environment, but then all this happened. I was like, well, can I change my topic and cobble together a paper based on our work? And then the talk I gave, where I worked in the chess playing automaton stuff. So I took that, and then that short paper ended with, and I think Rhetoric has something to say here. And then I slammed on all the rhetorical situation stuff and Taskscape stuff from our second product. And then added some things in there that might be useful. I talked a little bit about potentially what the rhetorical situation brings to Taskscape. And I talked about the concept of arrangement, because in one of those Ricker quotes, he talks about, the environment being a particular spatio-temporal arrangement. So the idea of, the Taskscape is not this kind of neutral backdrop, but it's arranged. And that's something that Rhetoric augments the Taskscape with by drawing attention to the fact that the Taskscape is itself can be arranged differently. So there's some language in there about arrangement that might be something. So, but it's a spin-off from the project. So I thought it might make sense just to host it somewhere.
Yeah. Yeah, potentially drafts might make sense. We might need to tinker a little bit because like the project overview meta document isn't precise any longer because it's more focused only on the first product. It doesn't really account for the others.
Yeah, maybe like instead of drafts, it's just like spin-off or adjacent texts.
Yeah. We may have a couple of those in the Google Drive folder as well, maybe.
Yeah, I'll put it in there first.
All right, well, that's the gist of it.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we're kind of hanging tight while there are other, revision suggestions for the second product. I'm assuming coming in. So.
Okay.
All righty. Anything else?
That's all I got. But no, I think we're at where as you point, the nozzle stage. But I think there's some directions here. I still think the allegations of cheating, I think, are interesting because of just reversal? And then
Yeah.
is there something about how the wildness of the allegations, I can't remember, I added the one that these are like the way that these are a reversal, right? Even that Gary Kasparov accused IBM of cheating, but cheating in the way that Mechanical Turk was cheating. So, as recently as the 90s, this was still, the fear was there's a human being inside of it. And so
Yeah.
there's something about that, the suspicion that generates, is that potentially, and then the idea that, yeah, anyway, I think there's,
Yeah. I mean, I think I think that's probably right now the strongest entry point into the discourse of the third piece. And it may even set up, because at base of that is kind of this question of the line between the human and the machine, and one being inserted into the other. I mean, it may be a kind of cultural techniques question of, it's the line that forms them,
right.
the separation between there being a machine inside the man, or the man inside the machine. All righty.
Okay.
Well, I will talk to you, I guess, fortnightly, or in a fortnight.
Okay.